Welcome back to the School of Muscle. Today, Dr. Melissa Davis joins me, and Dr. Davis, she holds a PhD in neurobiology and behavior and is currently the Vice President and Chief Strategy Officer at Renaissance Periodization. She has 10 years of research experience, and she's also earned various rewards for teaching, scholarship, excellence, research, and maybe even most impressively out of all of them, because I'm just like a shitty white belt over here, she's also a black belt in jiu-jitsu. So today we're going to kind of go over her most recent book that I have with me here, Evidence-Based Habit Building, How to Actually Get Shit Done. So with that, I think a good place for us to start here, Dr. Davis, is, I think most people have a good idea of kind of what a habit is. But I think that in your book, you do a really good job of kind of defining what we're actually trying to do when we say we want to build a habit. And you also do a good job of kind of explaining why they kind of take a long time to develop. And on the flip side, why they take a long time to break. So I think a good place to start is just kind of defining what a habit is, and then we'll kind of get into why they're kind of so tricky to break bad habits and also develop good ones.
Yeah, so a habit, I like to think about it as your brain kind of paving a pathway from a stimulus to a reaction so that you don't have to spare your conscious thoughts for that. So, for example, it's a really beneficial thing. Like if you had to think about every time you're going to push the brakes when you saw a red light, you wouldn't be able to sing in the car or think about the meeting you're driving to at work. If you had to consciously put effort into tying your shoes or brushing your teeth, it would take up a lot of your conscious thinking time and make it really hard for you to act in the world without doing everything sort of one at a time, piecemeal. So it's an awesome thing, but it can obviously become problematic. But the idea basically is that your brain finds something that you're doing that has some sort of reward, at least at the start. And it just sort of paves that pathway so that eventually when the stimulus arises that usually leads to that reward, or the stimulus that cues the behavior that leads to that reward arises, you just do it. You don't think about it. It's an automatic thing. And the kind of funny thing, and the thing that makes habits sometimes problematic, is that the reward can go away, but if that habit paved road is there, you'll keep performing the behavior. And you can kind of think about addiction as a super strong version of habit. There's some differences there, but just for, theoretically, just to get an idea, people who do drugs, there's a reward at first, and very often that reward goes away, but the compulsion to do the drug remains, and negative consequences start arising, and the compulsion is still there. And habits kind of have a similar thing. So the thing that initially rewarded the behavior can go away, but if your brain paved that pathway, you're going to keep doing it until you put effort into breaking down that pathway and getting rid of it.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that you mentioned in your book was that a behavior becomes a habit when the kind of action is a result of stimulus, kind of regardless of kind of the reward or consequence. And just like you said, it's like on a similar tone, not the same thing, but in addiction, there might not be the reward there anymore, but you kind of keep doing it regardless of that kind of consequence. And maybe a more relatable example for a lot of people, although addiction's very common, but we don't need to go down that route. But often people will go to a certain setting. So they'll go to a movie theater or something like that. And it's they don't even like popcorn. They don't even enjoy popcorn or movie theater snacks and stuff like that, but they still feel like they need to have them. Or, my friends will go to a football game and they feel like they have to have these certain foods or things at the game, and they don't even enjoy them. So it sounds like that is right alongside kind of what you're saying here with performing some action, even when there's not really that reward or consequence there.
Yeah, there's a cool study with specifically popcorn in movie theaters where they put people in a lab setting and they gave them super tasty, fresh, hot, buttery popcorn. And then they took other people to a movie theater setting and they gave them stale, kind of crappy, not buttery popcorn. And the people at the movie theater still ate more popcorn and reported they didn't like it. So it was just the movie theater stimulus just put them on the popcorn. But yeah, that's a perfect analogy, because a lot of people, even, other foods, maybe you bought a bag of chips, you were super into them, and then you're not hungry anymore, but you see the bag and you just go through the motion of eating them because you just see the stimulus of the bag that previously was paired with the yum reward.
Absolutely. And that kind of leads into that, there's seemingly quite a bit of content about, do this to build habits and do that to build habits. So it seems like it's a pretty tricky thing for people to do. And I think in your book, you kind of talk about how habits are actually very challenging to build. And I think you mentioned maybe around about 40% of intentions fail. So is that kind of go to show that habits are like not something that's very easy to do? And most people, do they tend to have kind of a hard time developing these habits?
I think it might be more a result of people not knowing that they need to build a habit. I think the failure, so like we call this gap between intention and behavior, the intention behavior gap. And very often, basically meaning like, I'm going to go to the gym every day, for the next 3 months. And then that's the intention and the behavior is different, right? So there's that gap. And very often that gap is caused by habits that people might not even realize they have that are preventing their behaviors from matching their intentions. So I think the 40% failure to do what you intend to do has more to do with people thinking like, oh, I just need to willpower my way through it, and not realizing that like a gradual change in structure and change in habits will actually lead to a better match between those intentions and behaviors.
And there you kind of mentioned willpower, and in your book, you have a kind of entire section on the importance or lack importance of willpower in building habits. So how important is someone's willpower when it comes to build habits? Like some people think that, if they just had more willpower, they could do anything they wanted. But how kind of important is that when it comes to this sort of thing?
Yeah, so there has to be some level of willpower just to go through the exercise of building the habit, right? Because that's work. And that's something that you have to have the will to do. You have to get yourself to do the work to build the habit. But I think the problem with willpower is if we rely on that as our sole source, our sole drive for doing the behaviors, it's probably going to fail, because willpower is kind of a lot of scientists will call it akin to like an emotion, like it waxes and wanes, different things affect it. Stress makes willpower drop, things like that. Whereas I'll kind of go through an interesting study just to illustrate that point. I'm going to tangent for a second here.
No problem.
So when you look at the effect of stress on willpower-driven behaviors versus the effect of stress on habit-driven behaviors, you see something really interesting. So a particular study that illustrates that nicely is the context was they're looking at students and they're asking them what they eat. And they kind of group them into students who eat healthy pretty habitually. That's just part of their lifestyle. They eat healthy foods. And students who kind of eat a little crappier. They go to the cafeteria, grab pizza. They're just a little less aware. When it comes to exam time, so in general, students are pretty stressed during exam time. The students, you would think all the students would start eating crappier. They're stressed. They'll grab something fast. But the people who actually had the habit of eating healthy foods ate healthy foods more often, because that was their habit. They didn't have the conscious effort to put into any other kind of thinking. They just did they followed their paved road, So if their paved road was to healthy foods, that's what they did more of. If the paved road was to crappy foods, that's what they did more of. Likewise, when you look at people who have a gym habit under stress, they tend to go to the gym even more. People who are sort of riding willpower to go to the gym a lot less when stress hits. So using willpower to build habits is important, but relying on willpower for your behaviors is probably a recipe for failure for most people.
Gotcha. So that willpower can kind of get the ball rolling, so to speak, but it's probably not the best idea to rely on that for long-term behavior change then.
Yeah, because a habit is, like we said earlier, it's automatic. Willpower is a roller coaster. It comes and goes depending on situations.
And in your book, you also discuss kind of various mistakes people make when kind of choosing a goal in the first place. And some things that you talk about were kind of only focusing on the outcomes, having non-quantifiable progress, ignoring obstacles. Do you want to maybe cover a few of the mistakes that people tend to make when they even go out to set a goal in the first place?
I think those are the ones you mentioned are all important. I think the one I see as the most important is sort of assessing your level, because beginners kind of need very different goals than more advanced people. And you can be advanced in every aspect of your life aside from the thing you have the goal in. So maybe you are, a successful business person, you have a family, you have, all kinds of things together, but you've never run a diet before. So no matter how competent you feel in life, you're a beginner in diet. And beginners in whatever goal arena they're seeking need to make very different goals than advanced people. And that's not just that their goals need to be smaller. It's also that the long-term goals need to be less specific. So to give an example of that, to make it make a little more sense, if you have a person who wants to lose weight, they've never dieted before, never thought about calories, never thought about macros, all this stuff is all new to them. If you ask them to set a specific long-term goal, they don't have the prerequisite knowledge to know what's reasonable. So setting a specific long-term goal sort of leads almost definitely to failure because it's just a guess. Whereas if you just give them the long-term goal of lose weight, and that's just general, then even if they're only losing a little week to week as they're learning, they'll still feel successful. Whereas if they set a goal of 15, 20 pounds and they, mess up their macros, they miscalculate as they're going through the learning process, they sort of lose the self-efficacy and feel like, no, I can't do this. I'm just not good at this. So beginners need to focus on sort of making learning goals to figure out what they're doing, making more kind of general goals for their outcomes, and then working on the behavior changes that they identify as they learn that will lead to their outcome goals. And then as people, interestingly, when you become more advanced, if you make the goal too general or too easy, you're more likely to fail because it doesn't feel like a big enough challenge for you. And people just tend to not be motivated by, if it's only a couple pounds and there's no exact outcome, you can kind of put it off or worry about it later. So beginners, very general goals, lots of learning goals going into that, lots of behavior goals, and advanced people, more challenging goals and more specific long-term goals.
Just to touch on one thing related to that. So I really like how in your book you kind of differentiate learning goals from more outcome related goals and different things like that, as often, like you said, people will kind of make that initial goal of they want to lose 20 pounds when a better goal for them might be, I want to learn what the 3 different macronutrients are and about how many calories a day I should eat. And then kind of once they get that down, they feel that sense of accomplishment, that self-efficacy, and then they can kind of move further and further towards kind of that outcome goal. And I think that with me working with clients more and more, is it, about having those behavior goals and those learning goals rather than choosing a specific outcome goal, especially for individuals, like you said, that are just starting out. We don't even need to worry about losing X amount of body weight this week. We just need to start developing these habits, and over time that will kind of take care of itself. So I really like that one. And are there some other mistakes that people make that you want to touch on when it comes to just setting their goals in the first place? Just
to add one more thing to that, the focusing for the beginners, focusing on those behavior goals and those learning goals, just taking the weight loss as an easy example that your audience is probably more interested in too. If they are looking at the scale and they're new to this, right? The scale does all kinds of crap, particularly for females, but for everyone, the ups and downs, it's not a linear thing. And that's hard to understand when you haven't learned about it and experienced it very much. So it can be very defeating and confusing. Whereas if you're did I hit my macros on all, 30 meals this week or whatever it is? That's something quantifiable that they can be yes, I was successful in all of that, and then know that the outcome will come irrespective of what the scale's saying. But yeah, to answer the question you actually asked, what are some other mistakes people make? Very often people and this is common even for advanced people, they make a goal when they're super comfortable, you're laying on your couch, you're having a glass of wine, watching a movie, and you're you know what, this summer I want to be super lean. I'm going to run this wild 3-month diet. I'm going to start working out 6 days a week when I only work out 3 right now. And I have, work trips and obligations and obstacles and all these things coming up that I'm not thinking about. It's very easy to plan to make yourself suffer when you're comfortable. When you're actually suffering, you kind of tend to downgrade what you want to do a little bit more. If you've ever gone and ran 5 miles and you're yeah, I'm going to hit 8-minute miles. By mile 2, you're 10-minute miles will be fine. So before you make a crazy goal, even if you're advanced, sometimes it's a good idea to get started on that first week of diet or whatever it is, that first week of hard training, and then maybe adjust your goals at the end of the week and set that as your final outcome so that you're not disappointing yourself. Because one of the biggest problem, one of the things that most makes people less likely to succeed in the future is a failure that makes them feel like they have less self-efficacy. So setting yourself up to have little wins sets yourself up for bigger wins in the long run, because you really do internalize like what you think you're capable of based on whether or not you failed or succeeded for whatever goal you set.
And I can totally relate to this one. I know that when I first wanted to make the decision that it's like, all right, it's time to start training martial arts, I need to start doing this, I was like, all right, I'm going to train jiu-jitsu 3 days a week, and I'm also going to do Muay Thai 3 days a week, and just dive headfirst. And I think maybe I lasted 1 week of doing that. I was like, wow, my body cannot take this.
Actually,
and then, yeah,
recovery is a thing. Yeah.
yeah, for sure. So definitely a clear example of doing that right there, and something I've experienced. I'm sure other people have experienced as well. And I think that for me, one thing that can definitely help is like first, like just setting those behavior goals of, hey, let's just go do jiu-jitsu twice this week, see how we kind of respond, and then kind of we can assess the longer term goal after there. And then also I like to think about like when I'm setting a goal, how much would I want to do this behavior like right now? If I had to leave the door and go do it right now, and I'm not just like sitting on my couch, how much would I actually want to do it? And if I feel like quite a bit of resistance, then maybe I should second guess the magnitude of what I can actually take from that goal and everything. So I think that that's a really good point. Are there any other kind of mistakes that kind of stick out to you or that you want to kind of touch on before we move on here?
Yeah, we touched on one of them a little bit already, but just focusing too much on outcome and not enough on behavior. We can somewhat control outcome, but only via behavior. So it kind of makes sense to put a lot of focus on the behavior and a lot less focus on the outcome, at least during the process, just because, like I said, the only way you're changing the outcome is by changing the behavior. So if you can get that behavior spot on, if you know if you work up to getting your behavior at 100%, there's no better you can do. Like if your muscles aren't growing more, but you're at your like top training, you're consistent, your diet's good, like that's just all you can do. And then you can know that you've achieved your own maximum. So that's an important one. Chunking things down, I think you mentioned, is also really important. It's hard for our brains to think out much past a year, and realistically even past about 3 months. So it's, I guess I should say it's hard for us to believe ourselves when we imagine a transformation across a year. That's like sort of the limit of what we can sort of conceptualize before it becomes more fantasy and less reality. And it's harder to work towards a fantasy than it is towards a reality. So kind of setting up like, what do I need to get done this week? And checking that off, making sure your behavior is on point, seeing what the outcome is. Is it matching your targets? Do you need to adjust your behavior more? Is a really good way to just like get into the process in the moment of the process instead of living in some future, outcome that you can't control or totally predict, because life happens too. You just got to go 1 week at a time, do the best you can each week, and setting up your goals in those kind of increments can be super helpful.
Yep, absolutely. And I know for me, one like big long-term goal is like that black belt in jiu-jitsu or to become more skilled there. But like when I focus on that, it's like, that's fantasy land. That's like a decade in the future. Yeah, exactly. So like right now, for me, it's like, all right, just keep focusing on every week. If you make jiu-jitsu 3 or 4 days a week, you're going to make progress and you're going to get better. And then maybe that first milestone that I focus on is that blue belt. And then from there, we can kind of focus on the next milestone. So kind of chunking those big kind of almost fantasy-like goals down into a shorter time frame and smaller steps. I think that is definitely helpful.
And I mean, it's not a bad thing to use those as a motivation to, get you going and to come back to them and think about it to motivate you to do those weekly tasks. But yeah, it's important to see the chunks too. I remember actually related to that, I remember standing in line. We would line up by belt. There'd be a row for each belt when I was a white belt. And I remember being in that back line of white belts and looking at the blue and purple and thinking like, oh my God, like I couldn't even imagine past purple. I was like, someday I'm going to be standing in that purple belt line. And it just seemed like that was insane, you know? And then one day I woke up and I was a black belt, and I thought back to that and I was like, somewhere in there, I forgot about looking that far forward, and it just happened.
Yep, absolutely. That's awesome. Cool. Well, I think that provides some good kind of groundwork for different mistakes that people make when they first even go to kind of set their goals. So I think now a good place to kind of transition is into kind of some more maybe general tactics that people can use for kind of facilitating behavior change. So in your book, a few that you kind of mention is like making sure that you understand your why and understand why you're actually wanting to achieve a goal, some social support, self-contracts, changing context, like we talked about with the movie theater and different situations earlier. So could you maybe hit on a few different more tactics that people can use to kind of actually facilitate this behavior change?
Yeah, so I'd say I'll go broad and then I'll go more specific with that. So in terms of making a broad plan, I think the sort of order of operations is you learn enough to be able to make a reasonable goal or make a general goal. And then you need to start finding a way to be mindful and more aware of your behavior, because part of the problem with habits is that they're so automatic, we don't notice that we do them. So starting to take a look, write down what behaviors do I need to facilitate this goal, what behaviors get in the way, and then start tracking, like how much do you do each of those behaviors? Because before you can really, it's just like trying to lose weight without a scale, right? Eventually you need to check into the data. So for your behavior change, you need to check into that data as well. So tracking what you're doing, when you're doing it, what emotion led to that, what cue triggered you to eat a whole bag of potato chips when you were planning to start a diet. What are these things that are making up your behavior? What's triggering them? When's it happening? How often? And just start writing all that stuff down, finding a way to track those behaviors as best you can. And then I guess the more specific is getting into how to change those behaviors. And you touched on one, which is your why. There's very strong evidence to suggest that people are way more likely to get something done if they have some sort of self-identity related to that. And very often we do, and we just don't really verbalize it to ourselves. Like, I'm losing weight because I want to look good naked. Well, why is that? Very often there's a less shallow sounding value that comes with it. Maybe to you, someone who is lean and fit exhibits like investment in their own health, gratitude for their life, a work ethic. There's a lot of values that go behind why we want to look good naked. So sort of identifying those can help ground you in the goal more. You feel more connected to it in a way that you can't just blow off like, oh, never mind, I don't want to be skinny, I want a cupcake. But if you think about I do want to be a person who sticks to what, I plan to do. I do want to be a person who's fit and healthy. I do want to be a person who's, exhibits their values with their body by showing that they work hard, and things like that can really help people stay on track when it gets tough working towards a goal. And obviously that applies to non-diet things too, but diet's just a good, easy example.
Yeah. And I think that one can really start a really positive spiral to where it's like, if you're able to achieve things in a certain area. So like for me, for example, it was first kind of fitness and lifting weights. I was able to kind of transform my body and see results there. And then it kind of bled over into every other area because I started identifying as just a more disciplined person that if I decide I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. And then that leads me to being more successful in career and, training martial arts, stuff like that. So I think that that's a really good one that can totally start a positive spiral.
And just learning how to do the behavior change process itself helps you in any aspect of your life, because then you have not only that self-efficacy and that sort of pride in your ability to be disciplined to get something done, but now you also have been working on and practicing these tools.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And then maybe one more tactic that we can touch on here that I really like and that has worked for me and also worked for clients really well, already kind of implementing with him after reading your book here, is creating a break between the stimulus and response. So often a client there's some sort of stimulus, and this stimulus kind of triggers them to want to overeat or to eat or make poor decisions when it comes to their nutrition. And if I could just get them to take a step back, give yourself just a gap, give yourself 20 minutes. If you still want to eat that food in 20 minutes, go ahead and do it. But more often than not, just creating that break in stimulus kind of prevents that bad behavior. Could you kind of maybe speak to this one a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's that sort of paved road. If you can put a little roadblock at the front of the road and slow that down for a minute, you can insert your conscious thought. So you're not just going on this paved pathway from stimulus to response. You're pausing and having conscious thought. And that's where you have a minute to assess, like, does this align with my values? Is this really what I want? Do I want to make this decision? And like sometimes, like you said, you still do. But very often people make a different decision if they have that little pause. And that can be done in so many different ways. One example of just the pause by itself is, maybe you go to a restaurant with friends on Friday night and like your stimulus is the waiter coming up. And as soon as they come up, you order that margarita and maybe you're trying not to. So you can ask the waiter to come back in a minute, sit and think about it, or practice before you go, practice saying, like Diet Coke or like some replacement. The other thing you can do that's sort of related, and it gets to the same idea, is looking at, and this goes back to that tracking your behavior, like looking at what are you getting from this thing. So maybe chocolate eating is your habit triggered by stress, right? So you get stressed, you eat chocolate, you feel better. So maybe you can think of different things that also make you feel better. Maybe taking a walk and listening to music, maybe calling a good friend, maybe, listening to a funny podcast, doing anything else that will give you a stress relief. So when you get the stress, you can say, wait, I have some alternatives. Let's try those. And if after I go on a walk and talk to my friend, after I listen to some music, if I still want chocolate, fine, I'll eat it. But very often you fulfilled the need that was there, and you've sort of broken that stimulus response and allowed yourself to make a conscious choice.
Absolutely. And in your book, this sounds very similar to what you mentioned about kind of replacing unwanted behaviors with more favorable ones. So exactly what you just mentioned. And then you also kind of discuss kind of chaining on positive behaviors that you like. So like if you're already in the habit of brushing your teeth every night and you want to get in the habit of maybe meditating for 10 minutes, maybe you chain that on. So right after you brush your teeth, you meditate for 10 minutes or something like that. So kind of chaining those can also be helpful. Yeah.
So because habits are initiated by cues, it's kind of a lot easier to find a cue that already exists. Whereas, meditate at 2:00. 2:00 isn't a cue, it's just a time. So if you attach the meditation plan to the thing you're already going to do every night, which is brushing your teeth, it makes it much easier to just attach that habit onto the existing cue. And then brushing your teeth becomes a cue to meditate. So that makes it much easier to form habits than just trying to like pin a time. Same goes for working out. Like if you can decide on a cue, like end of work, go to the gym, or, whatever it is, that can make it easier to add that.
Awesome. Well, I think that is coming up on all the time we have today. So thank you so much for coming on. People can check out your book. I think I have the paperback version because that's just my preference, but I think it's also on Audible. Is that correct?
Yep. It's on Audible.
Perfect. And it's Evidence-Based Habit Building, Finally Get Shit Done, with Dr. Melissa Davis. And she also, not only does she have a black belt, but she also has the best Instagram name I've ever seen, at Regressive Underload on Instagram. So you can find her there. Is there anywhere else that people should go to kind of find your stuff?
Mostly Regressive Underload, or at rpstrength.com. I have articles and stuff there and some other books.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. I had a good time.